About 20 years ago, I was attending a consultation on theological education in Nairobi. And event organizers had arranged it so that one afternoon we were going to take off from the consultation. We were going to attend the opening ceremonies for a new library that was being built on the campus of the Nairobi Evangelical Graduate School of Theology, which has since changed its name, by the way. But the previous library on this campus had been chicken coops, and now they had, 500 students, and they had tens of thousands of books, and the chicken coops were not working. So they had this very nice library built. And so we were there for the opening ceremony of the library, and John Stott, the British theologian and mission thinker and strategist author, Stott was giving the address. He was giving the keynote speech, which was, by the way, we were all sitting out in this gorgeous campus out in this big grassy field. I think it was only like 350 degrees that afternoon. But I do remember John's points, very much in line with the kinds of things you would expect Uncle John to say. Number one, God has commissioned a church. Number two, churches need pastors. Number three, pastors need training. Number four, to be well trained, pastors need books. And number five, books need libraries. So when he finished, Oscar Maru jumped up. He was the MC of the event, and he was the pastor of Nairobi, still is the pastor of Nairobi Chapel. Just an absolutely dynamic leader. One of the most, just in terms of raw leadership gifts, I don't think I've been around anybody that could eclipse him. And he immediately said, Pastor Oscar immediately picked up on this after the last point, books need libraries. He said, and libraries need books. You need to send us books. Well, when he got done, I thought about that, and I want to say I agreed with everything that John Stott said and everything that Pastor Oscar said. I would simply qualify it in one small way. It's not just pastors who need books. Every Christian needs books. I find it hard to imagine a Christ follower who is growing, who is not a reader. And I'm hardly alone. There has been a strong connection between Christians and books for 2,000 years. So today I want to talk about reading and about books. I was going to share, and the reason for positioning this podcast at this point is I was going to share at the end of this, and still will a bit, a list of the pre-Renaissance books that you should be sure to read. And I'm going to share a few, but as I worked on the talk, I came to realize that most of the books that I feel the most passionate about to try and get you to read are books that come after the Renaissance, Reformation and beyond, and that the books that are that are prominent pre-Renaissance there's not many of those books that I've read. Additionally, I probably am not going to get you to read 20 books, so I'm just going to give you 4 books to read. So I really downsized the list, and I thought instead I'm going to talk a little bit more conceptually about the importance of books and readings. So let me know. I do have lists. I think everybody's got lists. My list of books to read is not about the most famous books or the most influential books from the pre-Renaissance, nor is it the oldest books necessarily. The most historically important books. It's not my favorite list of books. Not even necessarily books. The list that I made is not always books that I agree with. You can find lists that are organized in all of those ways. There are all kinds of lists. And of course, the premier list of old books is going to be Mortimer Adler's list, the Great Books of Western Civilization. He was the editor of Encyclopedia Britannica, and I'm going to talk about him in a minute. Both Adler and his great book series. But the list that I had pulled together, and to some extent now winnowed down with these 4, sort of in keeping with my overall goals for this podcast, and that is, at the end of the day, I see this as a discipleship project. My goal is to help you understand the history of the church and also the forces and factors that are shaping you today that have developed over the last 2,000 years, so that you can live a more thoughtful life. You can live more thoughtfully, follow Jesus more thoughtfully. But before we get there and the short list at the end of the day, I want to do two things. One, I want to get you thinking about reading in general, and before we go there, I just want to remind you of where we're at in terms of the historical flow. So over the previous 30 episodes in this series, we've covered about 1,300 years, and so we've now arrived at the end of the Middle Ages. Another way to say this is that we are now at the very beginning of the Renaissance, which is this explosive period of rebirth. And it starts in the 14th century, and it's going to run, sort of going to carry Europe towards modernity. So 200-300 years, it depends. You've got all kinds of things that are going to start to happen. Age of Discovery, the Renaissance, the Reformation, which will all be followed by the Enlightenment. But the Renaissance is this rebirth when all kinds of cultural and literary and artistic and political and economic advances all take place. At least that's the common narrative that you get if you study most Western Civ classes. The Renaissance is when a number of people looked back past the Middle Ages, back to the ancient world, the Greeks and the Romans, the philosophers and the thinkers there, and they rediscovered all of these sources, and then they took off in that direction. So what you need to hear, and what I've been suggesting for a while now, is that if Western Civ, if the last 2,000 years, however you want to frame this, if church history is a swimming pool, we're about to jump into the deep end. History is about to become a lot more crowded and complex, and the pace of change is about to accelerate. So, before we get to that, I want to do a lecture, which is coming up next week, on human rights, so the history of the development of human rights, and then today I want to bring your attention to books. And by the way, one of the reasons I do the line here, and I wanted to look at pre-Renaissance books, I'll do another lecture later on, much later on book recommendations coming after that. But I drew a line in the sand because in 1440, Johannes Gutenberg develops the Gutenberg press, and that's going to change sort of writing and books and all of that fairly dramatically. So I thought it would be good to look at the Renaissance, the pre-Renaissance books. So, having said that, let me open up, the bulk of what I want to share are a baker's dozen set of comments about reading. Number one, reading is a gift. Try to imagine your life without books. Try to imagine your life without any reading. I consider reading to be one of the great blessings of being a pastor. I'm thankful that I have a job where I actually get to read. Indeed, I have to read. John Wesley famously said, read or get out of ministry. And he also made a comment at one point, someone was saying that pastors need to pray, pray, pray. And he said, yes, of course, pray, pray, pray. But pastors also need to read, read, read. And he had his Methodist circuit riders, and we'll look at this later on, but he sort of famously, although he was Anglican, he starts the Methodist church, and there was a method. So he had sort of untrained pastors. He had untrained lay people in pastoral positions, and there was a method. And part of the method that is eventually going to lead to the founding of the Methodist Church, part of the method included having the pastors read from 5 to 6, read the Bible together 5 to 6 in the morning, and then the rest of the day they were supposed to keep reading anytime they were traveling. Wesley read lots of his books while riding on horseback. Anytime they were traveling, they were to be reading, and to be reading from the rest of the Christian library. So anyway, point number 1, reading is a gift. We should appreciate the remarkable gift of books and the printed page. Number 2, Christians need to be readers. Yeah, it's not that hard to make some obvious links between the Christian faith and books. I mean, we Christians were called people of the book because we have the Bible. More literally, the Bible is a collection of 66 books, but so we could be called people of the books, I guess. But Christians are called people of the book. We have a book. Jesus was called the Word. The Bible itself tells us that we are to study. We're to be readers, we're to be thinkers, we're to be writers. From the very earliest days, Christians were writing books, and much of printing technology gets advanced because of Christians figuring out how to duplicate books. I think Eugene Peterson is right in his book, Eat This Book, when he argues that Christians need to read widely, wisely, and well. That we need to cultivate a thoughtfulness that flows out of reading, meditation, and reflection, of taking words into our soul, eating them, chewing them, gnawing, and being shaped by them. We are formed by what we read. We need to be readers. Number 3, the third point I would make is that reading develops us in ways that films and videos cannot. Perhaps that even sermons cannot. You've heard it said that the movie wasn't as good as the book. Well, it almost never can be. You could have I guess you could have a bad book that somebody turns into a good movie, but yeah, it takes 20 to 30 hours to read a book. It takes 2 to 3 hours to watch a movie. There's obviously just so much more development that goes into a book than goes into a movie. But it's not just that. As Neil Postman develops in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, we think differently when we're looking at objects than when we are listening or when we are reading. Our brain works differently, and we actually develop different kinds of thoughts. So I'm certainly not saying don't watch movies. And I'm not saying that all you can do is read. Good grief. This is a podcast. I mean, the very nature of this is that it's not the written word. So I am not down on other mediums, but I just am thinking that we need to be readers. So if you're just listening, or if you're watching, it's sort of like going to the gym and letting somebody else do the workout. Reading can be going to the gym and doing the workout yourself. Number 4. We need to be sure we're reading good books. So Steve Martin helpfully suggests that it would be easier if bookstores got rid of all the divisions, all the different categories, and simply got it down to 2, riveting and kind of boring. He also says he's tired of having those bullies who work there trying to force feed employee favorites on him all the time. So. Look, there'll be 40,000 new books out this year, adding to the global canon of 130 million books that are out there. Most of them are not worth reading. Very few are worth reading twice. You want to read good books. So I want to read an extended quote here from C.S. Lewis, perhaps no surprise, but he has a helpful essay called On the Reading of Old Books, and he writes, "There's a strange idea abroad that in every subject the ancient books should be read only by the professionals, and that the amateur should content himself with the modern books. Thus I have found as a tutor in English literature," and that was his day job. He was a professor of literature, medieval literature, first at Oxford and then at Cambridge. So I have found as a tutor in English literature that if the average student wants to find out something about Platonism, the very last thing he thinks of doing is to take a translation of Plato off the library shelf and read the Symposium. He would rather read some dreary modern book 10 times as long about all the isms and influences, and only once in 12 pages telling him what Plato actually said. The error is rather an amiable one, for it springs from humility. The student is half afraid to meet one of the great philosophers face to face. He feels himself inadequate and thinks he will not understand him. But if he only knew, the great man, just because of his greatness, is much more intelligible than his modern commentator. The simplest student will be able to understand, if not all, yet a very great deal of what Plato said, but hardly anyone can understand some modern books on Platonism. It has always therefore been one of my main endeavors as a teacher to persuade the young that first-hand knowledge is not only more worth acquiring than second-hand knowledge, but it's usually much easier and more delightful to acquire. He also goes on and argues that for every new book we read, we should read an old book. Or he says, at the very least, for every 3 new books you read, you should read an old book. Because he said that part of what you're trying to do when you read is to get somebody to help you see yourself. And he said modern readers can't see themselves in the world they're living in any more than we can. And he says it takes people from other cultures, or it takes people from other time frames to help us see ourselves more accurately. So, read the best books. Number 5, we need to expect reading to be hard. People today don't have much patience for hard books. But think about it. When you were learning to read, every book was a hard book. But the more you worked at it, the easier hard books became. In his thoughtful and very new book, Breaking Bread with the Dead, Alan Jacobs says, when you don't understand what you're reading, keep reading. It's called learning, and it's not supposed to be easy. The ancients used to say, mathene pathene, which is Greek for to learn is to suffer. At least at some level, some of the reading we do should be hard. So I'm gonna qualify Alan Jacobs and others, although I suspect Alan Jacobs would agree with me on this. Not everything we read needs to be hard. We can and should be reading at different levels. And Adler talks about this at some detail, some length in his book, How to Read a Book, which, by the way, John Piper says is the second most important book in his life. How to Read a Book by Mortimer J. Adler, the second most important book in John Piper's life, the first book, of course, being the Bible. So let me say a little bit about Adler because he factors into this thinking about reading. He was born in New York City in 1902 to non-practicing Jewish immigrants from Germany. He dropped out of school at the age of 14, and I just heard a lecture that he gave. He's passed away, but in like 1990, he gave a lecture at the Press Club in Washington, D.C., and it's still available at YouTube. I referenced it a few weeks back in the Friday update. And he was speaking about his education, and he said that, so back in the early 1900s, he said, like 70 or 80% of people dropped out of school when they were 12. They did it to go to work, and that's just what you did. And so he went to work at a newspaper, and he was the assistant to the editor, and he learned a lot. And while he was at some event with other editors, they sort of recognized that he was a very bright young man, and they suggested he go back to school. So he went to Columbia, and he got his undergraduate. He got a master's degree at Columbia. He also went on and got a PhD in Columbia. Oh, by the way, he had really come alive when he was working at the newspaper, when he got a hold of a copy of Plato. And he said, reading Plato at the age of 14 changed my life. So then at 15, he is encouraged to go to college. He goes to Columbia. He races through, actually, he confessed he didn't graduate. He goes on, gets a master's degree there and a PhD there, but he didn't graduate until like 1983 because he didn't show up at his PE class. So they failed the guy. He's recognized as like the brightest guy alive at some point, but he had not graduated from college because he didn't go to his PE class at Columbia. But he stayed there and is going to write and teach, and he is really going to become the guy who falls in love with the Western canon. Now this, of course, I mean, I'm sort of walking us through something that is merging church history and Western Civ, which is all enormously unpopular at the moment. We shouldn't be studying Western Civ. We were supposed to be studying Global Civ, or I'm not sure I know what we're supposed to be studying at this moment, but he is reading all the old books, and he becomes, while he's still a professor at Columbia, he becomes the editor-in-chief of Encyclopedia Britannica. And at some point, he and a couple of his friends decide that the Encyclopedia Britannica should publish this collection of the great books of Western civilization. And so they set out to try and figure out what those great books are going to be, and they come up with, I think the initial run was there was like 55 books. And he was defending this, by the way, in this lecture that I heard him give, because there was some critique. They had updated the list a few times. They'd added more people that were not simply dead white European males. They had added women and people of color into this. But he said, to be a great book, per their definition, you had to be a book that, it couldn't be a new book. They didn't look at any books in the 20th century, maybe not even the 19th century, I'm not sure. But you had to sort of be 100 years out for them to look at it. The book had to have been proving its worth. He wasn't interested in books that people agreed with or that were true, but they had identified 102 of the great ideas. So they just looked at all the important topics. And so it was money and war and freedom and marriage and love and all these. So they had 102 topics. And then they had all these, they had hired all these people to scour all of these books that they thought might be in that category, and to identify each time that the writer, whether it's Plato or Homer or whoever it's going to be, is commenting on one of these topics. And to be a great book, it had to be rereadable, so it had to be the kind of book that you would see yourself reading over and over and over. And it also had to be a book that had that commented on at least 25 of the 102 great topics. So he was not interested, by the way, if the book had sold a lot. He was not interested whether what the book said on these topics was true. If it was rereadable, if it had stood the test of time, and it was commenting on at least 25, he got that going. So then he went on, after that, he went on to help some colleges start that are just great book schools. So all you can study there are the great books, and then some honors programs that are focused on those things. So I share all that to say, one of the books that he wrote was How to Read a Book. And it is a book that talks about how we read at different levels. Elementary reading, which is what kids do, sort of skimming reading, which there's a reason to pick up a book and skim it and figure out whether it's worth reading. The third level, the level he pushes, is analytical reading, which is very engaged with the author. And then there's a synoptical reading where you're reading exhaustively on a topic. But I just want to say that you need to be reading good books. Number 6, do a deep dive on great authors. We all have the opportunity to find an author that we particularly resonate with and to allow them to mentor us by committing to reading everything we can get our hands on that they wrote. Think about this as an incredible opportunity. Descartes is credited with saying, "The reading of all good books is like conversation with the finest people of the past centuries." So who would you like to have over for dinner? And then imagine that you get to have a long and extended meal with Augustine or C.S. Lewis or Paul Bunyan or Pascal. I have not read everything that C.S. Lewis has written, but I've read a lot of it. He's one of the guys that I've done a deep dive on. Increasingly, that would be, for me, Tim Keller. I've read a lot of what Drucker wrote, a fair bit of John Stott. If you read a lot of the author, at some point you start to know how they think about things that they haven't written about. And you can be mentored, you can be discipled by some of these people if you will commit to reading and studying all that they've written. By the way, if this author is a pastor, it's almost as if they can become your pastor. So Piper again, but Piper said that he felt like lots of people would profit by having Jonathan Edwards as their pastor. And so he recommended that we read Edwards. By the way, reading Edwards, I'm doing some right now. It's a bit of a challenge. Some would argue that Edwards is the smartest, like the greatest intellect in North American history. Brilliant in philosophy as well as theology. But he was writing a while back. It can be a little tough. And if you're going to pick an author, if you decide, if I have motivated you to say, I'm going to pick an author, I'm going to read everything that they've written, you might want to check first. Want to get one of these people that have written, just 2 or 3 books, as opposed to somebody like Karl Barth, who I don't even know, 70 books. The joke used to be, nobody's read everything that Barth has written. Not even Barth has read everything that Barth has written. So, okay, number 7, mark up the book. This is a little bit like reading is hard work and you need to engage the author. But if you're reading at an analytical level, this is the 3rd level that Adler recommends, then you are thinking ahead, you're looking back, you're challenging the author, you're asking questions, you're trying to be actively engaged in this conversation. So you're underlining, you're disagreeing, whatever. This is, by the way, one of the reasons I have not made much of the transition. I'm an old guy. I've not made much of the transition to a Kindle. I want to mark up the book. I want to spill coffee on it. I want to fall asleep and drool on it. I don't actually want to do that, but I do want to engage the book, and it's going to look like I read it. Number 8. Don't make the mistake of thinking that books will change you just by reading them. So sure, there's a sense in which anything we do changes us. We could be changed by picking up a new hobby or watching a movie or, going on a diet or visiting a historic site. All those things are in one sense going to change us. But reading books, even great ones, does not guarantee that we will become a better person. If that was the case, there would be a lot fewer illiterate saints in church history, and there would be a lot fewer well-read jerks. And some of us know people in that last category. They found great books in the trenches of the Nazis in World War II. The fact is, you could be reading a great book and getting worse. It's not simply a matter of reading. We need to read with fear and trembling, asking the Holy Spirit to guide and edify us. Next point, I agree with Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson. If you encounter someone with great insight, rare intellect, somebody that you go, wow, this is a really thoughtful person, ask them what books they're reading. This is one of my go-to questions. When I find somebody who's interesting, I'll often say, what are you reading? Tell me about your reading list. What's on your nightstand? Lots of people have reading lists. Lots of pastors have lists. Pastors have lists of books for new Christians or, go-to books in apologetics or whatever. And so, and by the way, I used to love going into pastors' offices. It doesn't work quite so well anymore, but you go into a pastor's office and see their library, and you can tell a lot about a pastor pretty quickly by what what topics they had all their books on. I say it doesn't work so well anymore because since the internet, I purge books once a year, and I have to just, I don't have enough room, so I've got to make room, got to get rid of books I'm not using. And the books that I used to hold on to were all the reference books and commentaries and scholarly books. But that's often the information I can get online, and so I've really changed what my library looks like. But you can tell a lot about, you can learn a lot from a person by asking for the list of the books they're reading and recommending. And again, Adler's got the sort of quintessential list, the great books of Western civilization that they keep updating, by the way. Next point, read outside your tribe. Don't simply read people you agree with. If you lean left, read an article that suggests that welfare doesn't actually help many people. If you read right, if you lean right, read an article that suggests that big corporations are more danger to our freedom than big government. Theologically, I make a point to try and read authors that I know that I am going to disagree with. I want to read outside of my theological and political tribe so that I am being challenged, coached, nurtured, pushed. My thinking is being sharpened. Next point, plan time to read. I have seen statistics that suggest that 42% of Americans don't read a book after high school. Now, I think that number is high. But I did see another statistic that said last year, this was 2018, so in 2018, 24% of US adults admitted that not even reading part of a book. So look, if that's you, you're going to have to plan for it. And I know people say, I don't have to. I don't know where you find time to read. Well, look, we've all got the same amount of time. There's time to read. If you want to grow as a Christ follower, I think you're going to have to make time to read. If you want to read well and widely, you just need to have a book by you at all times. When you're waiting to get a haircut or at the doctor's appointment or you're 5 minutes early on the school pickup line, you got a choice. You can either pull out your iPhone and read Twitter feed and suddenly find yourself in a bad mood, or you could read something that's a little bit more thoughtful. When you're on an exercise machine, you could be listening to a book on tape. In the evening, in those moments when the family's otherwise occupied, you could turn on the TV, you can binge watch Netflix, or you could actually read for a half hour or an hour. If you go to bed a little bit early and read for 20 minutes a night, and I do this, read fiction at night. It's just enjoyable stuff. I don't want to have a pen in my hand at night when I'm reading. I want my brain to shut off. So you could read lots of books every year if you're just reading 20 minutes a night. So I do my offensive reading early and defensive reading through the day. So offensive reading is the reading that I'm doing that I have no immediate application for. I'm trying to feed myself. I'm trying to grow. I'm trying to expand myself. Defensive reading is reading I did, for instance, to prepare this lecture. So I had files on reading and I'm pulling together a talk, and so that's defensive. I'm already under the deadline. I am reading to get something done. Offensive reading I do early in the morning. Defensive reading I'm going to be doing the rest of the day, and then at night I'm reading fiction. A few more points. Give yourself permission to stop reading a book as soon as you lose interest. So there's 130 million books out there. If the book you're trying to read is not holding your attention, put it down. Let me wrap up. This is an area, reading, where I think you need to invest some energy. Proverbs 4:7 reads, "The beginning of wisdom is this, get wisdom. Though it cost all you have, get understanding. Cherish her, and she will exalt you. Embrace her, and she will honor you. She will give you a garland to grace your head and present you with a glorious crown. Reading is not a guarantee of gaining wisdom, but not reading is pretty much a guarantee of not gaining wisdom. In 2 Timothy, by the way, so the last letter that Paul is writing, in 2 Timothy 4, Paul says to Timothy, when you come, bring the cloak that I left with Kempis at Troas, also the books, and above all, the parchments. So the parchments are probably other New Testament books. So here's Paul, who has written books in the Bible. He is desperate to get copies of the other letters written, the Gospels and the letters written by Peter and James and John. And he's also continuing, at the end of his life, he's continuing to be desperate for books. Charles Spurgeon makes a similar point. He says, Paul is inspired and yet he needs books. He has been preaching for almost 30 years and yet he needs books. He has seen the Lord and yet he needs books. He has had a wider experience than most men and yet he needs books. He's been caught up into the third heaven and yet he needs books. He had written the major part of the New Testament and yet he needs books. We need books. So, having said all that, here are my 4 pre-Renaissance books that I'm going to recommend to you. Number 1, no surprise, the Bible. You didn't see that coming, did you? Number 2, Augustine's Confessions. So Augustine, the great church father, 5th century church father, I did a whole series on him, a whole lecture on him. Confessions is a book that's on just about everybody's list. This is his autobiography, one of the very first autobiographies that gets out there in the West. Some would say the first. He wrote it when he's in his 40s, but he's writing about his conversion, so he talks about his sinful youth, and so it's actually written as a prayer, Confessions. And they just came out with a new translation of it, by the way. Second book is also by Augustine, City of God. Technically, the name of this book is The City of God Against the Pagans, but nobody calls it that. He wrote this a little bit later. So Augustine is living at the time. He's down in North Africa. He's living at the time when the Roman Empire is collapsing, and there was a lot of people that blamed the Christians for the collapse of civilization as they knew it. And so he writes what is essentially an apologetic for Christianity. He's explaining the Christian faith. He's answering questions. He's explaining why the righteous might suffer. He's explaining just a lot of doctrine. And the chapters, it's got a different structure than a modern book. But this is the argument for truth. This is an argument for the truth of Christianity as over against other philosophies or other religions. Third book that I'll recommend, or actually this is the 4th book, so 2 by Augustine, the Bible, and then this is the 4th book. This is Thomas à Kempis's The Imitation of Christ. So this book technically might be a Renaissance book. He's not really a Renaissance guy. He's much more of a late medieval guy, but it's written in the 15th century. So by some reckonings, a Renaissance book. I'm adding it here because you should know about it. You might already. This is the book. Some say it is the 2nd best-selling book in the history of books. There's a little bit of debate and argument. Some would say the Quran is that. Others say, the Quran hasn't been sold, it's been given away. There's some that have pointed to Mao's Little Red Book. And the thought is there might actually be more copies of The Imitation of Christ, just often abbreviated, just The Imitation of Christ by Kempis that are out there. So it has been, I know, I was looking at some writings about it, that it went through 745 reprints by 1650. So that's a lot of reprints, and it was translated into more languages than just about any other book. So chapters are very short. It's a little bit deeper book. It's a Catholic book. There's a lot of emphasis on the Eucharist. And it's not the easiest reading because it's dealing with our interior life. It's not the easiest application because it's dealing with our interior world, and we're not always good with that. My wife is a big fan of this book. So I could give out some honorable mentions if you're really a reader. And the guy that's filming this is really a reader. So we heard at a staff meeting this past week, his goal is 140 books this year. So that's a lot more than I'll read. If you read them all, that's a lot more than I read. I probably start more than that. But anyway, honorable mention from before the Renaissance. Plato. 2 books by Plato. One would be The Republic. This is sort of the classic book on philosophy. The other would be the Apology, or Socrates' Apology. Socrates' Apology is actually written by Plato. Socrates dies. He's offering his defense. Apology in the classic sense of like defense of his life and his thinking and the charges. He's being charged with corrupting the youth. And Plato is his student, and so he writes down the sort of the court scene. 2 books on Jesus, Curdus Homo by Anselm. This was on the Incarnation and the Atonement, and then also a book on the Incarnation by Athanasius, just called On the Incarnation. I have read parts of The Rule of St. Benedict. It's interesting to me, maybe not to you. If you're not going to start a monastery, it's maybe not as helpful. I'm not going to start a monastery, by the way. Dante's Divine Comedy would be the other big focus. You're going to see this on lots of lists. So this is his 3-volume tour through the afterlife, hell, purgatory, and then heaven. And he's accompanied, of course, by different people. Virgil is the voice of reason, and Beatrice, who's bringing ideas of faith, and then you've also got others. Bernard of Clairvaux is bringing the whole idea of mysticism and helping him sort of process things. So importantly, not on my list. So I would steer you away from Summa Theologica by Aquinas. I talked about how important that book is. It's very important. It's very, very dense. Good on you if you can get through it. Josephus sometimes comes up. I've read a fair bit of Josephus because he's this Jewish historian that the biblical people go to, all his histories of things. It's okay. I'm not a fan of the intertestamental books that make it in the apocryphal, the apocrypha, the books that are in the Catholic Bible, not seen as being even by Catholics as being as inspired or canonical as the other books, but some people would expect those. And then if you go to any of the books of the must-read books pre-Renaissance, you're going to see things like Aristotle's Politics, and you're going to have the Iliad and the Odyssey and those kinds of things. I've not read them. I read Machiavelli, Prince. That's interesting, but I don't think I'm going to get you to read that many books. So I'm going to stick with the Bible and the 2 by Augustine, and then the book by Thomas à Kempis. So that's it. Next time, we are going to take a deeper dive into the exploration of the Christian origin of human rights. This is going to surprise some, but today human rights have become almost a religion to many people, and there have been, in the last couple years, the last 24 months, there have been a number of books that have come out by leading secular academics, Harvard law guy, a Cambridge professor, a best-selling BBC commentator, an author, all arguing that human rights have their origin in Jesus, and if there had not been a Jesus, there would not be human rights for anybody, let alone for everybody. So, that's it for today.